So this is the first in a series I'll be doing on state gun laws. I've broken it down into 9 or 10 categories, and you can check the description for timestamps if you want to skip around, but I'm going to try to keep it brief enough to where it's easy to sit through the whole thing. At the end, I'll be giving each state a grade. Since there's no way to arrange something like this in a non-arbitrary way, I'm going to go with the most arbitrary order I can think of, where a bunch of ancient Greeks randomly decided who goes first at PE. The alphabet. So let's talk about Alabama. Also, if you like this sort of content, do me a favor and like the video and subscribe. It helps me know what kind of content to focus on, and it's also a nice thing to do, and I appreciate it.
While the host of Fuddbusters is a lawyer, he is not your lawyer. If you pay him, maybe, either way you slice it, the video that you are about to watch is not to be construed as legal advice.
I think the best place to start when we're talking about state treatment of the right to keep and bear arms is a look at the state constitution and whether it has a provision protecting that right. Keeping that in mind as we go through the rest of the sections, we can get a feel for how much respect the state has for its own rule of law or something. So let's take a peep at Alabama's 6th Constitution, which, at nearly 400,000 words, is the longest and most amended still operative constitution anywhere in the world. Prior to 2014, Article 1, Section 26 of Alabama's Constitution read that every citizen has a right to bear arms in defense of himself and the state. This was amended in 2014 to make challenges to problematic gun laws more streamlined. The new version reads, A. Every citizen has a fundamental right to bear arms in defense of himself or herself and the state. Any restriction on this right shall be subject to strict scrutiny. B. No citizen shall be compelled by any international treaty or international law to take an action that prohibits, limits, or otherwise interferes with his or her fundamental right to keep and bear arms in defense of himself or herself and the state if such treaty or law or its adoption violates the United States Constitution. This provision is pretty interesting as it eliminates the confusion that state courts have in evaluating Second Amendment challenges. Post-2014, state courts evaluating claims that a law violates the right to keep and bear arms are to be subject to the most exacting judicial scrutiny, where the law can only be upheld if it is very narrowly tailored. That meaning that the law serves a compelling government interest and takes no more than is absolutely necessary to achieve it. Put another way, in most cases, if a law is subject to strict scrutiny, the government generally loses. Under the previous version of this constitutional section, the Supreme Court of Alabama had upheld state firearm laws. Whether the same will be held in the future remains to be seen. So now let's talk about restrictions on owning firearms. This is, in my opinion, the most egregious type of firearm restrictions, prerequisites on owning a gun at all. This section will be limited to ordinary federal Title I firearms like handguns, shotguns, and rifles. State restrictions on NATO guns the feds like to regulate will be in the cool gun restriction section. In addition to the federal prohibitions, Alabama law does specifically prohibit the possession of firearms if the individual has been convicted of a crime of violence or violent offense, or a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, is subject to a protection order for domestic abuse, or is of unsound mind. Additionally, Alabama generally prohibits the ownership of a handgun by someone under 18 years of age, someone who is addicted to drugs, or is a habitual drunkard. There are exceptions to the law prohibiting handgun possession by minors, though, generally if the minor has permission from a non-prohibited parent and it's on private property or for sport shooting, service in the National Guard, hunting, whatever. Or that the possession is in self-defense of the home, or the minor possessed the pistols as curiosities that were transported unloaded and securely encased. As far as mental health prohibitions goes, Alabama does more legwork than is federally required. Alabama requires judges entering involuntary commitment orders to forward the orders to the State Criminal Justice Information Center, who will take steps resulting in the information resulting in denial on a NICS check. Before 2015, this requirement applied only to commitment orders where there was evidence that the individual had a history of inappropriate use of firearms or posed a threat to do so. Now, though, it applies to all involuntary commitment orders. In 2021, this law was amended to require reporting and prohibiting treatment whenever an individual was involuntarily committed to either inpatient or outpatient treatment in addition to what we traditionally consider commitment. The result here is that people with mental health adjudications in Alabama are federally prohibited in more situations than federal law would require in practice. For what it's worth, this is one of 2 points that Giffords awards Alabama. In 2021, the state enacted a law requiring state law enforcement to develop a prohibited person database so that all law enforcement officers can easily see who is prohibited. This section is for laws that restrict how an individual can acquire a firearm. As of this video, Alabama has no law requiring a background check or specific records when buying from someone who is not a licensed dealer. However, if you're dealing with handgats in Alabama, this is the other thing that Giffords loves about the state. Dealers are required to get a specific license to independently review your identification and keep a record signed by and identifying you, the purchaser, of every pistol sold. This means that there's a state pistol dealer's license and permanent records of handgun purchases kept separate from what is federally required. State actors are required to provide any information that would be provided to NICS to the State Criminal Justice Information Center to the extent possible. State law does pay lip service to privacy here, stating that information collection should be used solely for the purposes of federal NICS compliance and that every effort be made to protect the privacy of this information. The state also forbids anyone from delivering a handgun, but not a long gun, to anyone they believe or have cause to believe is any of the following: a minor, subject to those exceptions we talked about, a drug addict, a habitual drunkard, a person of unsound mind, a person who has been convicted of a crime of violence, misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, or is subject to a domestic violence protection order. This is reversed if such persons have had their rights restored under the law. This law basically makes the prohibition work against both the possession of the affected individuals, as we talked about in the last section, and against someone who knowingly delivers a firearm to such a person. Most of the laws here echo federal law, meaning someone who violates the law here could be subject to prosecution at the hands of both the state and federal government. This echoing of federal law is slightly better than simply making reference to the federal law, but still potentially problematic in its own right. As far as background checks do go, FFLs in Alabama deal directly with NICS, with Alabama law simply reiterating the federal requirement that dealers must make a NICS check before transferring firearms. As we've discussed before on this channel, the right to keep and to bear something necessarily includes the right to acquire it, and the purest way to acquire something is to make it yourself. That's why it's definitely a point in Alabama's favor that it has no law restricting homemade, 3D printed, or otherwise lawfully unserialized firearms. As a fun personal anecdote, I actually built my first garage gun when I was living in Alabama. It was fun. Another obvious prerequisite to a robust and respected right to keep and bear arms is the ability to feed them. Just as a car without gas is of dubious utility, a gat without gatteries is similarly inutile. To start with some points in the state's favor, it has no laws requiring a license for the sale of ammunition, nor does it require sellers to keep records of ammunition purchasers, nor does it independently prohibit those prohibited from possessing firearms from possessing ammunition. That said, state law forbids the possession and sale of brass, steel, or Teflon-coated handgun ammunition or ammunition designed to penetrate bulletproof vests unless it is of the type designed to expand on impact. Of course, keep and bear includes bear. This might seem obvious to you as a rational person, but it is clearly something a lot of states struggle with. So let's talk about carry laws. The state generally forbids concealed carry unless you have a license. It also very specifically forbids the carry of loaded firearms in a vehicle without a permit. The law focuses on pistols, with rifles being somewhat of a point of confusion when kept loaded in a vehicle. The prohibition on carrying a handgun in a vehicle does not apply to those unloaded and stored in a container or vehicle compartment that is out of reach of the driver and passengers of the vehicle. Employers in the state are forbidden from preventing employees from storing firearms in their motor vehicles if the employee has a concealed carry permit. As far as issuing carry licenses goes, Alabama is a shall issue state, meaning the county sheriff must issue a concealed carry license to anyone aged 19 or older who meets the criteria. Carry permits are kind of a yearly fee type deal in Alabama, and you can pay for up to 5 years up front. Someone who already has one can apply for a lifetime permit, but a background check is conducted at least every 5 years. The state does not require permit applicants to complete a firearm safety course or otherwise have special training. The state is forbidden from disclosing identifying information of permit holders except to law enforcement personnel unless the licensee is charged in another state with a felony involving the use of a pistol. As far as carry permit reciprocity goes, Alabama generally recognizes permits from other states, and a good number of other states recognize Alabama permits, as you can see on this map, where every state in red recognizes Alabama permits. As for open carry of firearms, state law does not prohibit the open carry of firearms in public, but there was some confusion for some time as whether the open carry of a firearm could be considered disorderly conduct. In 2013, the state passed a law clarifying that openly carrying a handgun that is secured in a holster is not disorderly conduct on its own. Still though, if you open carry without a permit and wish to get into a car, state law seems to require that you unload and store the firearm out of reach before getting into the vehicle, which is both stupid and dumb. Now let's talk about where you can carry, starting with the hot button topic of schools. Of course, there is the background of the Federal Gun-Free Schools Act, but we're focusing on state prohibitions here. Alabama has no law restricting firearms on the campuses of colleges or university. It does, however, prohibit carrying a firearm on the premises of a public K-12 school with intent to do bodily harm. School resource officers, security personnel, and those with carry permits are exempt from that section, which is odd since it is a specific call-out with intent to do bodily harm. The only way I can make sense of this is that a defensive gun use situation would implicate an intent to do bodily harm to the attacker, and thus the state felt the need to exempt permit holders from this requirement. Either way, it's a weirdly drafted law. State law also prohibits anyone from possessing a firearm while participating in a public demonstration or within 1,000 feet of a public demonstration after being told by a cop to go away. In 2011, the state prohibited people from possessing a firearm at the State House. In 2015, the state added a prohibition preventing anyone, including permit holders, from possessing a firearm in a jail, psych ward, or building where local government is having a meeting unless you have specific permission. Similarly, people are generally forbidden from having firearms in police stations, courthouses, athletic facilities, and places that have security cards unless permission is given or the gun is locked in the vehicle out of sight. That might be a little more restrictive than you expected, especially given how recent some of those changes are. Self-defense is an interesting thing to discuss in this context, as it's not exactly gun law, but a closely related and rapidly devolving area of law. While it was recognized for hundreds of years that if there was one thing the government could not take, it was an individual's right to protect himself against unlawful force, of course, activists and motivated members of the judiciary wound up inventing creative mechanisms to cock all of this up. To combat this, Alabama adopted a statute clarifying that a person does not have a duty to retreat when their life is threatened, so long as the defending individual has a right to be in the place where he is. Here's where we'll talk about whether the state stacks stuff on top of the federal NFA and GCA when it comes to cool guns the feds don't generally want us to have. The state does not have any specific prohibitions on machine guns, assault weapons, or large caliber firearms. It does, however, require a specific state license for the sale of suppressors. In 2010, the state adopted a law allowing ownership of short-barreled rifles and shotguns as long as the owner follows federal law. The state does forbid one class of interesting gun, that being the carry of a firearm disguised as a walking cane, which is a felony. Another area that's really important that not enough people pay attention to is rights restoration. There have been some categories of people that lost their right to arms from the early days of our nation, but even then, these were rarely permanent. Alabama has a system of rights restoration, but it is not the best. For people with a mental health adjudication, the law allows them to petition the district court to get their rights back. They can present evidence and witnesses in support of their petition. The court must grant relief if the judge finds, based on a preponderance of the evidence, that being like 51%, that the petitioner is not likely to act in a manner dangerous to public safety. For people who have firearm disabilities as a result of criminal convictions, the only recourse is through a pardon through the Alabama Board of Pardons and Parole. If the pardon is not full and unconditional, it must specifically restore firearm rights, else they remain curtailed. State law specifically provides that an expungement does not restore firearm rights, and thus the individual must still go through the pardon process if they want to be treated like a full human being again. Finally now, miscellaneous provisions, various and sundries, and then after this, we'll get to grading the state. State law in Alabama preempts local firearms law, meaning local governments are generally unable to restrict guns, although there are some exceptions. These exceptions allow local governments to do things like zoning restrictions, restrict gun ranges, local laws that parrot state law, allowing the local taxation of guns and ammunition, and allowing local governments to shut down gun shops when the public good or safety demands it. Aside from that, there are no magazine capacity laws, red flag laws, safe storage laws, or Saturday night special laws in the state of Alabama. Alright, let's grade it. I've been deciding whether to do specific calculable metrics for the grade in the series, or just going based on my gut. For this first episode, I'll be grading based on the Harvard University standards, and just making it up as I feel like. Alabama is decidedly an okay, I guess, state for guns. There are lots of vestiges of bizarre post-Civil War policies that have strange results, such as vehicle carry and handgun suspicion. More importantly, though, the more recent developments in Alabama law suggest to me that the state legislature has a very weak interest in safeguarding the rights and security of their more marginalized constituents. The expansions in reporting requirements and ever-dwindling ability to restore one's civil rights in Alabama, as well as the expanded availability of personal information to law enforcement officers, poses concerns for gun rights in the state. It smacks of a law and order jurisdiction, which may more be interested in its ability to detect and enforce the law than the right of its people to be free in their persons and effects. Plus, the state's echoing of federal law in the short-barreled arena is bizarre and unnecessary note of approval of dubious federal gun laws. For these reasons, I'm going to give the state of Alabama the relatively high score of B-. Think I'm wrong, or did I miss something? Well, let me know in the comments. I expect to make a follow-up in the future if things change with this state. Remember also to look at the date of this video, as many things may be different if you're watching much later on. That's it for today, guys. Let me just say I really appreciate you guys watching and subscribing. It makes a huge difference. If you want to support me more than that, I started up a Patreon and a Subscribestar. There's all kinds of benefits like a patron-only podcast, a Discord, and there's surely going to be more to come. This kind of support will help enable me to make more content more regularly, something I'd really love to be able to do. There's also a link to some new and improved Fuddbusters apparel, stickers, and the Magic ATF ball in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching to the end and for your support. I'll see you next time, or if you join up on Patreon or Subscribestar, I'll be happy to see you on the Discord. Remember, the anti-side has been working long and hard, passing laws and trying to push more policy. Anything more than minimum compliance is self-regulation. Y'all take care.